But yes, thank you. I am the founder and CEO of Maven, the global knowledge marketplace. I'm not here to talk too much about Maven, although if you have questions about it, we can certainly get into that. I'm here more to talk about something that impacts Maven and that Maven participates in, that I think affects pretty much everybody in this room, and frankly, pretty soon is going to affect everybody worldwide if it doesn't already. And I call that the freelance economy. I'm going to start off with three things really quickly. An apology, a definition, and then a few questions for you before I get into the materials that I want to show you. So the apology is I'm a numbers guy, and this presentation has a lot of numbers in it, a lot of statistics, a lot of studies that have been run on the nature of freelancing and the freelance economy, the changing nature of work in America and globally. So I apologize. There's a lot of numbers. Hopefully, the numbers will tell a story that makes sense to you, and we'll get through it as quickly as we can. Second, a definition. Just a second. Let me. Am I going the wrong way? Yeah. There we go. When I say freelance, I mean that interchangeably with freelancer, 1099, independent consultant, contractor. There's lots of different words for the same thing. I'm going to say all of these words during this presentation. They all mean the same thing. So with that definition in mind, freelancer, contractor, 1099, independent consultant, somebody who does work for somebody else and gets paid by that person but is not considered to be that person's employee. So even if you're working for a company but they're not filing a W-2 on you, they're not paying taxes on you, then you're a freelancer, a contractor, right? How many people in this room are freelancers and contractors? Yeah, that's more than average, as you'd expect in the creative professions. But what I'm going to show you is that pretty soon, that is not going to be atypical, right? So once again, creatives are kind of leading the charge, and have been for centuries, frankly, towards a new definition of what employment and work actually means. So let's get started. Oh, by the way, of those of you who are freelancers, how many would prefer to be W-2s? Yeah, pretty typical. Of those of you who are W-2s, how many would prefer to be freelancers? Work for yourself? Oh, not too many. Wow. That's really surprising. That is atypical. Okay, so let's go back 6 or 7 centuries. It's the Middle Ages, it's a feudal society, and people for centuries really kind of measured their ties to a single employer in terms of generations, right? So think about it, you're a farmer, and your father was a farmer, your sons will be farmers, if you were a man, your wife was probably the daughter of farmers, your daughters will marry farmers, and you will all work for the same person or the same group of people above you in that social hierarchy from now until the end of time. It's always been that way, and it will always be that way. And then starting really with the Renaissance and then moving into the Industrial Revolution, new ideas started to take hold, economies started to break down, the old ways of doing things weren't working as well anymore. There were new opportunities for people. And we have this really odd idea of the Industrial Revolution as looking something like this, right? People working in big factories, sweatshops and everything else. But what you notice if you look closely at these people is there's a pretty interesting mix of men and women. And they all none of them really seem to be suffering all that much, right? So what happened with the Industrial Revolution was the nature of work, the nature of employment started to change. And it created new opportunities and new mobility for people that hadn't existed before. So fast forward to the 1950s and 1960s. When my father and my grandfather were in the workforce, you really expected when you graduated from college that you might spend an entire career working for a single company, maybe 2 companies. Right? Maybe you, like these guys, split off and create your own. But that's actually a more mobile situation than what had existed in the past. Right? We'd moved from generations to a few decades in a matter of a few hundred years. And then something happened, and the trend began to accelerate. Technology advanced, new communications capabilities came into being and became widely adopted. And today, this is how we think of work. This is at least how a lot of us think of work. I think of work this way. I get up in the morning, I roll out of my bedroom, I walk about 30 feet to my office, sit down at my computer, start working with the 35 or 40 Maven employees around the world whom I see very, very rarely, even though lots of them are actually in San Francisco with me. And it's because there's really not a big need for us to all be sitting there staring at each other. And so work actually started to change, or has been changing from a place that you go to something that you do, right? We don't think necessarily of going to work anymore. We think of working, right, wherever we happen to be. To really crystallize how fast this trend is accelerating. And by the way, the net impact of that is because of additional mobility, because of the fact that you don't have to necessarily be in a particular place in order to do your work, especially if you're a knowledge worker, the number of companies that you work for, the number of employers that you have over the course of your career is expanding very, very rapidly. When I graduated from engineering school in the late 1990s, they told us that we were going to spend, or that we would, on average, work for 7 different companies over the course of our careers. 7. That was an astonishing number in 1998. I was like, 7, good God. My father worked for 2, 3, then he retired. 7 companies. The most recent numbers that I've been hearing for what they're telling new college grads today, just 15 years later, 15, 20, sometimes more, I think the real number is actually a lot higher. So mobility is accelerating, professional mobility is accelerating very, very quickly. And pretty soon, as far as I can see, at-will employment is going to become truly at-will. In other words, you might work today for one company, tomorrow for a few hours for another, for a few minutes the next day for another, and over the course of your career, you might have thousands of employers. So here's my hypothesis. The American workforce, and I should kind of cross out American and say global workforce, is increasingly made up of freelancers, and growing numbers of businesses are relying on contract work rather than full-time employees. And now I'm going to prove it to you. Here's where we get into the numbers. Before we get to the numbers, lots of shrill headlines about this. The point of this slide is not to pass judgment on whether this is a good trend or a bad trend, but to point out to you that all the way back to 1999, this term permatemp, so this idea of permanent temporary employment, was already in the press. And if it didn't get to the press until 1999, then it was probably actually happening in 1979, because it probably took them that long to catch up with it. So this is nothing new, right? The idea that people are freelancers or moving between multiple forms of short-term employment is something that's been going on for a very long time. In 2010, 68% of all US hiring was contract-based. 68%. 2/3 of all of the people hired to work for on something anywhere in the United States 2 years ago were hired on a contract basis, not as full-time employees. The number of non-employer businesses grew by 38% from 2000 to 2010. What's a non-employer business? It's a company that doesn't employ people, but has people do work for it, right? So they have 1099s, they don't have W-2s. And this is a really startling statistic. There are actually 21.7 million companies in the United States that employ no people on a full-time basis, which is 4 times as many companies as do employ people on a full-time or W-2 basis. So stay with me. We're going to get through the stats as quickly as I can. The average number of W-2 employees of a new business in 1999, 7.5. 2011, 4.5. So the number of actual full-time employees that people are putting on their payroll is shrinking very, very rapidly, faster than it ever has before, frankly, in human history. US freelancers worked an average of 39 hours per week in 2010, but 55% of freelancers expected to make more money in 2012 than they had in 2011, which might create the impression that there's lots of sort of lazy, overpaid freelancers out there. Clearly that's not the case. We'll see more about that pretty shortly. But interesting trends to note. An estimated 1/3 of American workers, that's about 42 million people, today make their livings as freelancers or contractors. So 42 million is a pretty big number. It's a lot higher than I expected it to be when I started doing this research. Complicated slide. Key thing here, US companies, new US companies, these are new companies that are formed in the years that are shown, that have decided to hire contract or temporary workers as opposed to full-time employees. And you can see going all the way back to 2009 that this number or ratio has been increasing very rapidly. And of course, the Freelancers Union is the only trade union in the United States that is actually currently increasing its membership. All of the major unions are shrinking. All of the traditional labor unions are really suffering and struggling today, and yet this new entity called the Freelancers Union is going bananas. So our friends over at Elance, we're a San Francisco company. Elance is right down the road from us in San Mateo. They do a lot of work on this topic as well because they, like we, employ a lot of freelance labor. 54% of workers employed by Elance's customers, so the companies that Elance considers to be its customers, will be freelancers in 2017. So the majority of people that they employ within a few short years are going to be freelance workers as well. And here's the punchline. By 2020, there will be 70 million freelance or free agents in the United States, which is equivalent to the entire population of the United States west of the Rocky Mountains. And for the first time in history, there will be more 1099s than W-2s. So what we just saw when we did the questions at the beginning, how many people are freelancers? The majority of the people in the room raised their hands. Creative economy, creative professions are at the leading edge of this trend, as you would expect. The trend isn't limited, of course, to creatives. It's happening everywhere. So I mentioned before, and I'm going to wrap up with this, Maven is really interested in this because, as Nomiki commented at the beginning, we've built a platform that allows you to tap into the knowledge or share your knowledge with other professionals on a very short-term basis, right? As little as a few minutes of your time. And as a result of that, we employ, in quotes, about 250,000 freelancers worldwide. We're actually one of the largest consulting networks in the world. We probably will be the largest within the next few months. And my designer actually has a spelling problem. But we went out to a bunch of the people in our network who self-identified as full-time, self-employed, or freelance contractors. And we asked them to kind of talk to us about what they liked and disliked about their lives as freelancers. And some of the answers are things that you might expect. What surprised me was that money was only the fourth highest, or the number 4 response for the main advantages of freelancing. So people value, obviously, flexibility, the ability to live and work where they choose, to pick and choose the clients and projects that they work on, and so on and so forth. Obviously, income and cash flow and stability and certainty of next gigs and things like that were the major disadvantages that they highlighted. And last slide, or last stat, from the same study, we asked people, how much money do you make? Or more precisely, do you make more now than you used to when you were a W-2? And 2/3 of the respondents said they used to make at least the same amount, if not more money, than they do today. So we went back and asked those people, the folks that are making the same or less than they had been as full-time employees of a company, do you want to go back? And the results were almost identical to what we saw at the very beginning here. The answer was no. Only about 1/3 of the people who are making less money today than they were before would actually prefer to go back to being full-time employees. So when you read in the press about this trend, there's a lot of speculation as to why this is happening, and there's lots of reasons why it's occurring. The message here is that, yes, companies are pushing for lower overhead. Companies are trying to reduce headcount. Companies are trying to make use of a wider variety of resources that are available to them because of some of the new technologies that are available. But equally, employees themselves are pulling themselves out of the traditional workforce and trying to become freelancers. I'll leave you with a quote from Riva Lozansky, who's the former editor of Entrepreneur Magazine. And the key thing at the bottom is something that we heard in the previous panel. Rather than being traditional freelancers, many of these people who are becoming, quote, freelancers are really freelance entrepreneurs who are crafting businesses out of projects, and I'll put an addendum onto that, creating a personal brand. So when we talk about starting a company, that company could just be you. Right? It doesn't have to be 50 people surrounding you doing the same thing that you do. Cool.
So I have basically just one question for you, and then I figured I'd open up to the audience. I think this is fascinating. You know, I think in terms of politics and what this means for the future of the economy and for generations. If we're becoming this 1099 culture, this freelance culture, what do you think this means in terms of the divide between the C class, which receives benefits, 401ks, all these things that come with big companies, and really, lack of a better term, the working class, individuals starting out, even if we freelancers do enjoy the work-life, balance, some people have families and they want to have 401ks and they want to have a very stable future, even if they are. Do you see a divide in the future?
Do I see a divide? I don't know. Part of our purpose when we created this research was really to look at what's happening and help to spread the word to people about what's happening, and not necessarily to pass judgment on that. This isn't something that's going to occur in the future. It's already happened. And the people who are best equipped and most ready for that are the ones that are going to take the greatest advantage of it and be able to be successful. But you can't avoid it just by pretending it doesn't happen. Are there policy changes that could be made to help mitigate some of the negative impacts of this? Absolutely, without question. Actually, I was going to go back to that one. No benefits, payment collection and timing, personal expenses, home life impact, you're always an outsider. Some of the major reasons. I'm sorry, loneliness. Yeah. Some of the major reasons why people don't want, or the major disadvantages that people have pointed out about being freelancers, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody here. But the no benefits piece and a lot of the commentary that we sourced as part of this study was really the really pertinent issue. People were saying, all these other things I can deal with. I don't, yeah, it's lonely, but who cares, right? Yeah, I have a little bit of work-life balance issue because now I'm working at home and, my wife or husband is really unhappy that I'm always around. But I can deal with that. That's a personal issue, not a professional issue. Benefits, healthcare, things like that are major problems that have been identified that there just don't seem to be any real solutions for yet.
I mean, the Freelancers Union, if you guys aren't aware of, is great. They do offer affordable health care and a bunch of other benefits. And I think that New York is the only, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the only city that there's like a building that the Freelancers Union has healthcare services, but they offer it across the country, different services. So
yeah, that's right. And part of the reason why Freelancers Union is growing so quickly is precisely because of that. That they have figured out a way, for lack of a better term, to socialize some of the or a better way to say it is to collectively bargain for certain types of benefits that are lacking to traditional freelancers.
So anybody have any questions? All right. First hand I saw.
Early on you had mentioned about the American workforce, and you accurately mentioned that it's really a worldwide workforce.
Yep.
How, the border, it's not an immigration issue, is very porous.
Yeah.
As it relates to foreign workers participating in our economy. What
right.
about the reverse? How do you see that?
What about American workers participating in foreign economies?
Yeah.
Maybe not the right question for me to answer.
I can chime in really quick.
Yeah, go for it.
I do have, they mentioned that I ran for office.
Let me ask something.
Yeah.
how
Sure.
about foreign workers participating in the American economy as freelancers?
We didn't specifically look at that topic, although it would be interesting. I would guess that if I had to guess, because of the nature of the immigration structure in this country, and maybe you can comment a little bit further on some of the policy and legislation, that it's probably more difficult for a foreign worker to be a freelancer in the United States unless they fall into one of a few categories, actually many of which fall in the creative realm. Is that right?
I was actually going to comment beforehand.
Yeah.
The immigration debate's very complicated, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff happening right now. But I ran for office in Arizona, in Tucson, Arizona, and one of the major conversation topics was that there was 2 major universities in the district, and all the graduates were leaving. And when we actually looked at the numbers to see where these graduates were going, most of them were Americans. A significant number, like 30%, were going to take jobs overseas. And it wasn't just that they were leaving the district because the economy was bad in Tucson or southern Arizona. It was the economy was bad in America. And I just thought that was staggering. I mean, it's different depending on where you are, but I think that there's a little bit of a brain drain across America right now, and the freelancers.
Speaking from personal experience, there are more opportunities for that today than there ever have been as well. I mean, I ended up within a year of graduating from college. I was 22 years old. I had an engineering degree, which didn't mean that I could do engineering. But I lived in Singapore, and then they sent me to France for a year, and then they sent me to Italy for a year, and then they sent me to Germany and Amsterdam and a billion other places for another year. And it was because those opportunities exist, and there was demand overseas for some of the types of talent that are available here in the United States in greater abundance than exist elsewhere.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the demographics of people that you've been seeing, and specifically, do you think that your product also applies perhaps to the older demographic who might be looking for a job after they have left their traditional job in their 50s and 60s?
Great question. Let me address the second part of that around kind of what Maven does first. About 95% of our total membership worldwide, and it's about 250,000 people in 175 countries, are mid-career, well, I'm sorry, are not retirees, let's put it that way. So only about 5% of people have actually formally retired from the workforce and now are looking for some part-time opportunities available to them. Our core business is what we call micro-consulting. So we've actually made it possible, as I mentioned at the beginning, for somebody to market and monetize as little as a few minutes of their time, right? Whether that's over a short phone consultation or by responding to a paid electronic survey on a professional topic. And then we scale those people up over time into ever larger and more complex engagements. I'll give you an example that's pertinent to the people in this room. A couple weeks ago, we had a customer that came to us as a venture capital firm, and they were considering investing in a small company that was developing a new software suite for music education. And there's 5 or 10 of these things floating around that are used in the music schools across the country. They wanted to learn more about the competitive offerings, see if the technology that this company was developing was disruptive enough to warrant an investment. And so we went out and we interviewed a whole bunch of music teachers on their behalf. And music professors, and got their perspectives on the kinds of things that they were using and the gaps in the marketplace. That customer ended up making that investment and then hiring through Maven 3 of those professors, or 3 of those music teachers, it was 2 session musicians and a professor, to actually consult on a full-time basis to the company as they develop the product. So, we start typically with a very small chunk, and then we expand people out to bigger and bigger opportunities as those opportunities present themselves.
How are we on time? Okay. One more question? Yes. Go ahead.
What do you think of the company like Yahoo that's kind of doing the opposite of what you're...
I wish I had brought those slides. We just finished a follow-up survey where the critical question was exactly that. What do people think about remote work? Where is the drive for remote work coming? And ultimately, how do both employers and employees feel about Marissa Meyer's recent decision? Not just Marissa, Best Buy did the same thing. A handful of other companies jumped on board in her support. And overwhelmingly, the response was, It might have been a good decision for Yahoo, but for most companies, the desire is actually to allow people greater freedom and flexibility. And the push for that, or the drive for that, is coming equally from both sides. I was particularly surprised by this statistic. What's the right word? I would have perceived that companies were acquiescing to employee demand. I want to work remotely. I don't want to come into the office every day. I'd like to spend more time with my family, and so on and so forth. And in reality, what's actually happening is companies and employees are equally pushing for this. It's something that everybody apparently wants. So, overwhelmingly opposed to Marissa Meyer's decision for most companies, and drive equally coming from both parties for remote work.
Just to follow up to that.
Sure.
But Yahoo isn't dealing, that wasn't for freelancers.
It was not for freelancers.
Right.
It was for full-time employees. But the idea of being able to, or the underlying reasons for being able to conduct remote work are identical to the underlying reasons why freelancing is accelerating so rapidly, right? Which is better communications, better infrastructure, better technology.
Right.
Cool.
Thank you very much, Wyatt.